The city never sleeps, but it forgets. It forgets the names of people who fall between the cracks of its great indifferent machine, people who once had addresses and routines and the small dignities of ordinary life. It forgets them the way a river forgets the stones it rolls over, smoothing them down, wearing them quiet, carrying them nowhere. Renata Voss knew what it felt like to be forgotten. She had lived it for 3 years, and the weight of being invisible had settled into her bones with the patience of something permanent. She was 34 years old, though she looked older in the way that hardship ages people, not cruelly, but honestly, etching the truth of a life into the face for anyone willing to look. Her hair was dark, streaked at the temples with silver that had come early and without apology. And her hands were rough from work, and her eyes, a quiet, searching gray, had the quality of someone who had learned to read every room she entered for warmth, exits, and threat. She had once been a hotel concierge in the downtown district, the kind of woman who knew every restaurant within 6 blocks, who could arrange airport transfers at midnight, who remembered the names of returning guests and their preferred room temperatures. She had been good at her work. She had been proud of it. Then came the layoffs, the kind that arrived not as singular disasters, but as slow erasures. First the hours were cut. Then the department was restructured. Then her position simply ceased to exist, replaced by a tablet mounted on a marble stand that smiled at guests with a frozen corporate expression. By the time she understood what was happening, she was 3 months behind on rent, and her daughter Mila was 8 years old and asking questions Renata could not answer. They had moved through 3 temporary situations in the span of 18 months. A cousin's couch, a motel on the edge of the highway that smelled of cigarette smoke and river damp, a shared room in a family shelter on the east side of the city, where Mila did her homework on a narrow cot beneath a flickering fluorescent light, never complaining, which was somehow the hardest part of all. A child who does not complain has already learned to expect less than she deserves. Renata worked. She always worked. She took cleaning shifts at a hospital, cashier hours at a grocery warehouse, weekend shifts at a dry cleaning shop where the steam made her skin burn. She worked the way people work when they know that stopping, and even for a moment, means sinking. She sent Mila to school each morning with whatever breakfast she could manage, a granola bar, a bruised apple, a small carton of milk, and told her to pay attention to her teachers and to remember that their situation was temporary. She believed this, or she tried to, in the same stubborn way that a person keeps walking through rain without an umbrella by telling themselves the distance is shorter than it looks. She had almost no family left. Her parents were gone, her father to a heart attack when she was 19, her mother to a long and quiet surrender to grief 3 years later. She had an older brother she hadn't spoken to in a decade, the kind of estrangement that begins with one bad argument and is sustained by pride on both sides until it becomes indistinguishable from permanent. And there was her uncle, Arthur Voss. She had met him only 4 times in her life. He appeared at family gatherings the way eccentric people do, briefly, intensely, and then vanished again into a life that seemed to exist in a different world from the rest of them. He was her father's older brother, a man who had traveled broadly in his youth and returned to the city decades ago to purchase a hotel on the eastern edge of the old commercial district. The Voss Grand, it had been called. She remembered reading about it once in a local history article that referred to it as a jewel of the post-war era, a 6-story building of limestone and dark brick that had hosted traveling businessmen and minor dignitaries through the 1950s and 1960s. The article had been illustrated with a black and white photograph of the lobby, which featured a sweeping staircase, a marble front desk, and chandeliers that the caption described as hand-cut bohemian crystal. By the time Renata was born, the hotel had long since closed to guests. Arthur had shuttered it sometime in the 1980s, when a combination of neighborhood decline and competition from the new highway-adjacent chains had made operating it no longer viable. He had continued to live in a private apartment on the building's top floor, maintaining the structure at the minimum standard required by the city, paying what taxes he could, resisting all offers to sell. The building had collected code violations over the years the way abandoned places do, slowly, inexorably. The roof had been patched and repatched. The electrical system was a patchwork of old wiring and jury-rigged fixes. The city had declared it condemned twice, both times stepping back from formal action after Arthur paid fines and produced contractors who made just enough repairs to forestall demolition. When Arthur died in January, he died alone in his top-floor apartment with a law degree from 1959 hanging on the wall and a handwritten will on yellow legal paper that no one knew existed until a lawyer named Delphine Marsh sent a certified letter to Renata's shelter address. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Renata almost didn't open it, assuming it was a collections notice. She sat on the edge of the shelter cot while Mila slept, the envelope in her hands, turning it over twice before slitting it with her fingernail. It was brief. Arthur Voss had died intestate in all practical senses, and except for one handwritten addendum attached to a document filed with a small estate attorney the previous autumn. In that addendum, he had left the Voss Grand Hotel, the property at 412 Calloway Street, to his niece, Renata Voss, in its entirety, including the building, the land beneath it, and any contents therein. She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long moment, looking at the wall of the shelter room, at the peeling paint and the water stain above the window, and felt something move inside her that she hadn't felt in years. It was not joy. It was not hope, exactly. It was more like the feeling of a compass finding north, a faint internal orientation toward something she could not yet name. In the morning, she told Mila they might have a new place to go. Mila, who was 9 now and had her mother's gray eyes, looked up from her granola bar and said, "Is it ours?" Renata said, "It might be." The Voss Grand Hotel stood at the corner of Calloway and Dement, in the part of the city that urban planners described as transitional, which was a word that meant it had once been something and might become something again, but was presently caught between those two states with no particular urgency. The surrounding blocks were a mix of boarded storefronts, a few tenacious small businesses, a laundromat with a hand-painted sign, a salvage yard 2 streets over. The buildings around the hotel had the look of things that were waiting. The hotel itself was 6 stories of limestone and dark brick, as the old article had described, though the limestone had gone gray with age, and the brick above the 3rd floor was shadowed with decades of soot and weather. The iron fence surrounded the small lot adjacent to the building, half of it bent or missing. The marquee above the entrance, the one that had once spelled out Voss Grand in bold brass lettering, now read only VSSGRN, the missing letters having fallen or been taken years ago. The front doors were boarded. The ground floor windows were covered with plywood sheets that had been painted over by generations of graffiti, layered and sun-bleached into a palimpsest of tags and partial images that no longer meant anything. Renata stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it for a long time. A man walking a dog slowed as he passed her, glanced at the building, then at her, and shook his head slightly. He did not say anything, but his expression said enough. She crossed the street and put her hand on the iron fence. The metal was cold, rough with rust. She looked up the face of the building. Several windows on the upper floors were still intact, their glass dark and reflecting the pale winter sky. On the 4th floor, a curtain moved faintly behind one of them, though there was no one there. Just air finding its way through the old structure, breathing through the cracks. She had the key the attorney had given her. She found the side entrance, a narrow door set into the alley wall, its wood swollen in the frame. It took her 3 attempts and her full weight before it gave. The smell that came out when it opened was not the smell of ruin, not rot exactly, but something older and more complicated. Stone and time and the particular dusty sweetness of a place that has held many human lives and now holds only their echo. She stepped inside. And the city talked about it within 48 hours. She had not meant to attract attention. She had gone to the building twice alone, walking its floors with a flashlight, making notes in a small notebook about what she saw. The structure was sound in the places that mattered. The load-bearing walls were intact. The basement was dry. The staircase that curved up from the lobby, the one in the old photograph, was still there, its banisters carved from some dark wood, dusty but unbroken. The chandeliers, or what remained of them, still hung in the lobby, their crystals filmed with gray but still present, still catching what little light came through the boards over the windows and throwing it in faint, broken patterns across the plaster ceiling. But she needed to check the roof, and she needed a contractor for that, and which meant she had to make calls. And the contractor, a man named Perez, who came recommended by the estate attorney, brought his assistant, who mentioned to his girlfriend, who mentioned to her brother, who mentioned it at the corner store on Dement Street, that someone had inherited the Voss Grand and was planning to do something with it. By the end of the week, the story had traveled the neighborhood. By the middle of the following week, it had reached the ears of people who had opinions, which in this city was everyone. Renata heard them at the laundromat, where she still worked her Saturday shifts because she still had no other income and could not afford to simply stop. Two women folding sheets near the dryers, talking without lowering their voices. Heard some woman inherited that wreck on Callaway. Arthur Voss's niece. Oh, they say. What's she going to do with it? Lord knows. Building's condemned. Nothing but a liability. She homeless, that's what I heard. Living in a shelter somewhere. A pause. The sound of sheets being snapped and folded. That's sad. Just trading one place she can't afford to keep for another. The other woman laughed, not cruelly, just with the tired recognition of someone who has seen this story before. City'll take it from her inside a year. Back taxes alone would bury a person. Renata kept her eyes on the shirt she was folding and said nothing. At the shelter that evening, she sat with Mila after dinner, and they looked at the photograph she had found in the hotel, a framed print she had carried out carefully wrapped in an old towel. It showed the lobby as it had been in 1954, the year the hotel opened. But the lobby glowed with the light of the chandeliers. The marble floors were polished to a mirror, and behind the front desk stood a man in a dark suit who had his chin lifted slightly, with the expression of someone who believed in the thing he was building. She was almost certain it was Arthur, photographed young, before time, and the world had made him solitary. Mila studied the photograph. It was pretty, she said. It still is, Renata told her. Underneath. The calls from the city came first. The Department of Buildings sent a notice requiring her to appear for a compliance review within 30 days. The back taxes on the property amounted to more than $40,000 accumulated over several years when Arthur had fallen behind and been granted extensions that he had only partially honored. The estate attorney, Delphine Marsh, walked her through it patiently, but her patience carried a gentle undercurrent of warning. The city could move to seize the property for unpaid taxes. The condemnation status meant she could not legally occupy it or conduct business within it without first bringing it to code, which would require permits, inspections, and construction that she could not possibly afford. What are your options? Renata asked. Delphine Marsh had a habit of being honest without being unkind. You can sell it as is. Given the condition and the outstanding taxes, you would not receive much. Perhaps enough to settle the debt and have a small amount left. Or you can fight to keep it, seek financing to bring it up to code and attempt to develop it somehow. But I want to be truthful with you. The financing options for a condemned property with no income and significant debt attached are very limited. How long do I have before the city can move on it? If you begin demonstrating good faith, filing plans, making payments, perhaps 8 to 12 months. But that's not guaranteed. Renata nodded. She thanked the attorney and walked out into the January air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her breath making clouds in the cold. She did not consider selling. She was not sure she could have explained why, exactly, to anyone who asked. There was nothing rational about her refusal. The building was a liability. It was, by every practical measure, a trap, a money pit, a condemned structure in a marginal neighborhood inherited by a woman with no capital and no safety net. She knew this. She could see it clearly. And yet she kept thinking about the marble floors under the dust, the staircase with its carved banisters, the chandeliers with their filmed crystals, the photograph of a young Arthur in his dark suit, and the basement, which she had only walked through once briefly with her flashlight, its beam moving over stone walls and old oak doors and the particular quality of darkness that belongs to places that have been deliberately closed. She thought about the tree in the second inspiration story, the one she would never read but somehow understood through the bone-deep grammar of the same story being told in different words across generations. The tree that lived on rock when everything else died. The thing that survives because it has found purchase where no one thinks to look. She went back to the hotel. She began going every day, and she had a key, and she had the side door that now opened on the first pull. She brought a better flashlight, a pair of work gloves, a thermos of coffee, and a notebook. She walked the building systematically, floor by floor, the way she had once walked through the rooms of the hotel where she worked, checking for anything out of order. She noted what needed to be done and what did not. She noted what was worse than she had feared and what was better. The top floor, where Arthur had lived, held the remnants of his domestic life. Stacked newspapers, books, a radio from the 1970s that was still plugged into the wall, a narrow bed neatly made, a kitchen where the dishes were still in the cabinet. The will, or rather a copy of it that the attorney had returned to the property, sat in a manila envelope on the kitchen table, and then beside it was a handwritten note in Arthur's cramped script. It said only, "She will know what to do with it. Keep the basement locked until it matters." She read the note 3 times, as she had read the attorney's letter. Then she looked at the padlocked door at the back of the stairwell, the one that led to the basement stairs, and felt the same faint internal compass pull she had felt before. She did not go to the basement yet. She wasn't sure why. Something in her uncle's words suggested waiting, or perhaps suggested that she needed to understand the building first, to earn it the way one earns trust, through presence and patience. So she worked. She began clearing the lobby alone, a process that was absurd by any measure. A single woman with no resources attempting to reclaim a condemned building through the force of her own 2 hands. She swept. She hauled boxes of old paperwork to the alley. She removed rotted fabric from the chairs near the front desk. She unscrewed the boards from one of the lobby windows, and when the winter light came in, she stood in it for a moment and watched the dust swirl in golden columns through the old room, and felt something she could not name except to call it recognition. The neighborhood saw her coming and going. The man at the laundromat across the street, whose name was Felix, began leaving a cup of coffee on the window ledge for her in the mornings when he arrived for his shift. He never explained the gesture. She never asked him to explain it. She simply picked up the cup as she passed and raised it slightly in his direction, and he nodded without looking up from his work. Others were less generous. A woman who lived in the apartment building catty-corner to the hotel came across the street one afternoon while Renata was hauling debris from the lobby. She was perhaps 60, her silver hair pulled back severely, her coat buttoned to the chin against the cold. "You're the one who inherited this place," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Renata said. "You're wasting your time." The woman looked at the building with an expression somewhere between contempt and grief. "My husband used to stay here on business trips when we were courting, 1961. It was beautiful then, heartbreaking what it's become." I'm trying to change that. With what? The woman's voice was not cruel, but it was flat, with the authority of someone who has lived long enough to know the difference between effort and outcome. You don't have the money. Everyone can see that. You're a woman living out of a shelter cleaning a building that the city could take from you next month. There's no future in this. Renata looked at her steadily. I know what people can see, she said. I'm more interested in what I can see. The woman studied her for a long moment, then turned and walked back across the street without another word. That night, Renata sat in the lobby on an old chair she had cleaned and repaired, a candle burning beside her, a cup of cold coffee on the floor, and thought about what she was doing and why. She did not think in the language of investment or development. She thought in simpler words. She thought, this building is still standing, everything in it bent toward its end, and it did not end. She thought, my uncle kept the basement locked until it mattered. She thought, a tree grows on rock if it grows where the water is. She thought, I am not done. The word spread further in the second month. It reached people whose involvement was motivated by something less charitable than concern. A property developer named Sinclair Graham contacted the estate attorney with an offer. It was low, calculated for someone in a desperate position, the kind of offer that exploits the gap between what a thing is worth and what a person can afford to refuse. $42,000, enough to cover the back taxes and leave almost nothing. The offer was communicated through a letter that included the phrase, given the property's liabilities and your current circumstances, which Renata read 3 times, then sat down on the floor of the lobby where she was working and looked at for a moment before picking it up and folding it into the smallest rectangle she could manage and putting it in her coat pocket without responding. She heard Graham's name again a week later when she was at a city permit office trying to understand the compliance pathway for a condemned structure. The clerk at the counter, a bored man in his 50s who had seen every kind of petition and probably approved very few, happened to mention that Mr. Graham had inquired about the rezoning potential of the Callaway Street parcel. Residential mixed use, he said. 15 stories. On the land underneath the Voss Grand was worth considerably more than the building on top of it, at least to someone with the capital and the will to knock everything down. Renata thanked the clerk and walked out of the office and stood on the steps of the municipal building in the cold February air and understood for the first time the full shape of what she had inherited. Not just a condemned building, not just a liability, a target. She went back to the hotel that evening and, for the first time, unlocked the basement. The padlock was old, its brass casing green with oxidation, but the key from the attorney's envelope turned in it without resistance, as though it had been recently oiled. The door swung open on hinges that were silent, which surprised her. She had expected the groan of neglect. Instead, the door moved quietly, as if it had been maintained with deliberate care. She stood at the top of the stairs and shone her flashlight down. The stairs were stone, their edges worn smooth in the center from decades of foot traffic. The walls were limestone block, the same limestone as the building's facade, and they were dry. No seepage, no efflorescence, no sign of moisture damage. The air that came up from below was cool and carried a smell she recognized after a moment. The particular dry coolness of a place that has been carefully sealed. Not the smell of abandonment, the smell of preservation. She went down slowly, one hand on the stone wall, the flashlight beam moving ahead of her. The basement was larger than she had expected. It ran the full footprint of the building above, with a ceiling of low stone arches supported by thick columns. The floor was original tile, still intact, still clean, the small hexagonal pattern of the old hotel era that she had seen in photographs of lobbies and service corridors from the period. The space was divided by partial walls into several distinct areas, what had once been the laundry, the mechanical room, the wine cellar, the staff room. Each door she passed was closed. Each door was locked. But at the far end of the basement, Beyond the last column, and set into the deepest wall, was something she had not expected. A vault door. It was steel, its face perhaps 3 feet across, recessed into the stone of the far wall. It was old, its design consistent with the industrial safe room technology of the 1940s or 1950s, with a combination wheel and a levered handle. There was no rust on it. Its surface was clean. And the combination wheel turned without resistance when she touched it experimentally, though she did not know the combination and did not yet attempt to open it. She stood in front of it for a long time, her flashlight illuminating the steel face, the wheel, the handle. She could hear nothing except her own breathing and very faintly the sound of the city above, muffled by the stone and the earth. The basement was absolutely still. She thought of her uncle's note. Keep the basement locked until it matters. She thought of the building standing for 70 years while the neighborhood changed around it. She thought of Arthur maintaining the padlock, oiling the hinges on the basement door, living alone on the top floor for decades, resisting every offer to sell. She thought of a man who had lived close to a secret for a long time, not spending it, not revealing it, simply keeping it, waiting. She placed her palm flat against the vault door. The steel was cold beneath her hand, but it held an undertone of something different, the way cold metal sometimes holds the memory of warmth within it, the way stone walls in old buildings carry the ambient temperature of the lives lived inside them. She did not know what was behind the door, but she knew with a certainty that she could not rationalize and did not try to, that whatever was there had been waiting for her specifically, with the patience of something that understood that the right person would eventually come. She went back upstairs. She locked the basement door. And she stood in the lobby in the dark and thought about the combination to a safe built in the 1950s by a man who had left her a building and a note and a locked door. And she thought about what she knew of her uncle, which was very little, and then she thought about what she knew of her family, which included the things her father had told her when she was young. He had told her once the year of his birth, and his parents' anniversary, and the address of the house where he grew up as a child, before the family moved, before everything changed. He had told her because he said she should know where she came from. Numbers, he said, are how families keep track of themselves. You can lose everything else, but you remember the numbers. She stood in the dark lobby and looked at the wall where the old guest register had once hung, and she said the numbers quietly to herself. Her grandmother's birth year, her grandfather's, the year the hotel had opened, which she had read in the article and remembered because she had a concierge's memory for details, the address of the old family house. She went back downstairs. She tried the first combination. Nothing. She tried the second. Nothing. She tried the year the hotel opened, 1954, combined with the house number, 17, combined with her grandfather's birth year. The wheel caught. The mechanism shifted. The levered handle turned. The vault door opened. The light from her flashlight entered the space behind the door slowly, the way it enters any place that has been closed for a very long time, as if the light itself is uncertain of its welcome. The interior of the vault was perhaps 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep, in its walls lined with shelves of steel, and on those shelves, arranged with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what they were placing there, was everything. She did not understand everything she was seeing. Some of it was obvious. Stacks of paper currency, banded and categorized, their denominations visible at the edges. Some of it required longer looking. Flat wooden cases that she would later learn held rare coins, their contents cataloged in handwritten ledgers stacked beside them on the lower shelf. There were paintings, small ones, wrapped in linen and stacked vertically in a wooden frame built specifically to hold them. There were jewelry cases, old ones, their velvet surfaces slightly faded. There were documents, folders of them, labeled in a handwriting she recognized from her uncle's note. She stood in the vault doorway with her flashlight and looked at all of it, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not think about the back taxes, or the city notices, or Sinclair Graham's offer, or the shelter on the east side, or the granola bars she cut in half to make them last 2 mornings instead of 1. She stood there and breathed. Above her, the building was silent. Around her, the stone walls of the basement held everything still. And in the vault, in the particular dry darkness that her uncle had maintained with oiled hinges and a working padlock for longer than she had been alive, lay a fortune that no one in the city, not the developers, not the building department, not the man across the street with the dog who had shaken his head, not the woman in the buttoned coat, not anyone, had thought to look for, because they had been too busy laughing at the building to see what the building kept. She sat down on the floor of the vault room, her back against the door frame, her flashlight in her lap, throwing its beam at the ceiling, and she let herself feel it. All of it. The exhaustion and the cold and the memory of 3 years and the particular ache of a woman who has been told by the world in 100 small and large ways that she is not worth looking at twice, and who has kept going anyway, not because she was certain it would lead anywhere, but because stopping was not something she knew how to do. She thought of Mila, asleep on the shelter cot with her homework done and her lunch packed for tomorrow. She thought of her uncle in his top-floor apartment, alone for decades, the city changing around him, the offers coming in and being refused, year after year. The man in the dark suit in the 1954 photograph, the one with his chin lifted, the one who believed in the thing he was building. She thought of the note. She will know what to do with it. She sat there on the floor of the vault room for a long time, long enough for the cold to seep through her coat and the light from her flashlight to begin to yellow slightly as the battery aged, long enough for the city above to grow quieter as the night deepened. Then she got up, closed the vault, turned the combination wheel back, and went upstairs to make some calls. The first call she made was to Delphine Marsh. It was past 11 at night. She made it anyway, standing in the hotel lobby in the dark, her flashlight propped against the old front desk, so it threw a cone of light at the ceiling and lit the room in a pale, diffuse glow. And the chandeliers above her caught it and scattered it in faint, broken pieces across the walls, the same way they must have scattered the light of 100 evenings in the years when the lobby was alive. Delphine Marsh answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of a lawyer who has learned not to be surprised by anything her clients do. Renata told her what she had found. She was precise and brief, the way she had been precise and brief as a concierge when relaying unusual information to management, stripping the emotion out of the facts and letting the facts carry their own weight. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted several seconds. "You said a vault," Delphine said. "Yes. And inside the vault. Currency, coin cases with ledgers, paintings wrapped in linen. Oh, jewelry, documents. I don't know all of it yet. I didn't touch anything." Another silence. "Renata, I need you to lock that basement door and not go back down until I have arranged for a proper assessment. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good. I'm going to make some calls in the morning. There are people who handle this kind of thing. Estate appraisers, authentication specialists. We need to understand what you have before you speak to anyone about it. Anyone. Do you understand?" "I understand." "And Renata." A brief pause. "Don't speak to Sinclair Graham or anyone associated with him. Not a word." She locked the basement door. She went back to the shelter that night and lay beside Mila in the narrow dark, listening to the sounds of the building, the ventilation, the distant corridor conversations, all the settling of the structure around its sleeping occupants. And she did not sleep. She stared at the water stain above the window and felt the knowledge sitting inside her like a stone in still water, heavy and real and motionless. She did not celebrate. She did not allow herself to. She had learned, in the way that people learn things through deprivation, that hope extended too far in advance of evidence tends to collapse under its own weight. She would wait. She would see what the evidence said, and then she would know what she had. But she also knew, the way she had known when she first opened the vault door and her flashlight beam moved over those shelves, she knew in the same bone-deep way that the farmer in the old stories knew that the wind had not died, only waited. She knew that something irreversible had happened in that basement. The world had shifted on its axis by some small but permanent degree. She could not yet name the size of the shift, but she could feel it. She slept near morning briefly and dreamed of the lobby chandeliers turning slowly in still air, their crystals throwing light across an empty room. Delphine Marsh moved quickly. By Thursday of that week, she had arranged for a preliminary visit from an estate appraiser named Conrad Poole, a man in his late 60s who had spent 4 decades cataloging the contents of old properties, estates, warehouses, and the occasional institution. He arrived at the hotel on a gray February morning with 2 assistants, a rolling case of equipment, and an expression of professional skepticism that Renata recognized as the occupational default of someone who has been called to assess things that turned out to be worthless too many times to approach anything with uncalibrated optimism. She led him through the lobby and down the basement stairs without preamble. She unlocked the padlock, opened the door, descended. At the bottom, she moved aside and let him go ahead with his flashlight. He was silent for a long time, moving through the space, opening the unlocked side doors to look into the laundry room and the old wine cellar, which turned out to contain, behind its original racks, a row of sealed oak cases that she had not noticed on her first visit. Then he reached the vault room. She handed him the flashlight and stood back. The 2 assistants had their own lights. She watched the 3 of them move through the vault space, their beams crossing and recrossing the shelves, their voices low, professional, stripped of the kind of emphasis that might indicate surprise. Conrad Poole looked at the coin cases for a very long time. He picked up one of the handwritten ledgers and read several pages in the dim light, his brow gathered in concentration. He set it down carefully. He looked at the wrapped paintings without unwrapping them, though he touched the edges of the linen and bent slightly to smell the wrapping, which seemed to tell him something. He opened one of the jewelry cases, looked at the contents for a moment, closed it again. He examined the stacked currency without touching it, though his flashlight lingered on the banding and the denomination markings. And then he stood in the center of the vault room and turned slowly, taking in the whole of it, the way a person turns slowly in a place when they want to hold the totality of it before it changes. He looked at Renata. "How long has this vault been sealed?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," she said. "My uncle lived here until he died in January. I believe he maintained the building and the basement regularly, but I don't know when he last opened the vault itself." "Your uncle assembled this collection?" "I think so, or inherited parts of it. I don't know the full history yet." Conrad Poole nodded slowly. He looked back at the shelves. "I'm going to need several days to do a proper preliminary assessment," he said. "I'll need to bring in colleagues for the paintings and the jewelry specifically. The coins I can handle. The documents will need a separate review." He paused. "I want to be careful about making any statements before I have done a thorough evaluation." "I understand," Renata said. He looked at her again with the same careful professional expression, and then something shifted in it, not unprofessionally, not dramatically, but in the way that a man who has spent 40 years assessing things allows himself, very briefly, to be a person rather than an assessor. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "A shelter on the east side," she said. He nodded once, as if absorbing that. Then he turned back to the vault and began taking notes. The days that followed had a quality she had not experienced before. They were simultaneously the most ordinary and the most charged of her life, and she continued her hospital cleaning shifts because she could not afford to stop, not yet, not until she knew something concrete. She continued picking up Mila from school. She continued eating whatever was available at the shelter and stretching it into 2 portions. She continued existing outwardly in the same register as before. But beneath that surface, everything had changed its frequency. The shift she had felt the night she opened the vault had not faded. It had deepened, the way the sound from beneath the rock deepens in the 2nd story, moving from a whisper to something that pulses through bone. She moved through her days carrying the knowledge like a held breath, waiting for the exhale. Conrad Poole called on the 4th day. He asked her to come to the hotel. She went immediately. He was in the vault room with 2 colleagues she hadn't met, a woman who was introduced as an art authentication specialist named Dr. Serena Vance, and a numismatist named Dr. Harold Brace, who had driven from 3 hours away and was still wearing his coat. The 3 of them had clearly been working for several hours. The vault was lit by portable work lights that the assistants had brought, and in that light, the contents of the shelves looked different from the way they had appeared in flashlight beams. More real, more present, more specific. Conrad Poole introduced her to his colleagues and then began, without ceremony, to tell her what they had found. The currency was straightforward in terms of identification, though extraordinary in terms of quantity. It was primarily large denomination bills from multiple decades, some of it old enough to carry premium collector value beyond face value, all of it legal tender, all of it authentic. The stacks were organized and cataloged, consistent with someone who had accumulated it deliberately over a long period of time and maintained it with care. The coin collection was what Dr. Harold Brace had driven 3 hours to see, and his voice, which was otherwise entirely flat with the controlled manner of a man who distrusts enthusiasm on principle, carried a faint tremor when he described it. The cases contained a complete collection of double-eagle gold coins, the $20 pieces minted between 1850 and 1933, including several of the St. Gaudens design that were among the most sought-after coins in American numismatic history. There were also Morgan silver dollars in extraordinary condition, several complete piece dollar sets, and a collection of pre-1933 gold coins that included rarities he had not personally seen outside of institutional collections. He had spent most of the previous 2 days simply documenting what was present, and he was not finished. The paintings, 5 of them wrapped in the linen, were the subject that had brought Dr. Serena Vance's voice to a careful, deliberate quietness that was its own form of intensity. She described them methodically. 2 were American Impressionist works from the late 19th century by painters whose names Renata recognized vaguely from her education, names that carried weight in the world of auction houses and museum collections. One was a small Dutch Golden Age panel painting, and the kind of work that occasionally surfaced from private European collections and caused significant disruption when it did. 2 were mid-century American works, whose attribution required further verification, though preliminary examination suggested they were significant. All 5 were in remarkable condition, having been stored properly in a temperature and humidity environment that the stone vault had apparently maintained naturally, consistent with the basement's position below grade and the thickness of the surrounding limestone. The jewelry cases held items across several eras: Victorian mourning pieces, Edwardian settings with stones that required gemological evaluation, mid-century pieces in styles consistent with the 1950s and 1960s, and several pieces that appeared to predate the hotel entirely, that suggesting inheritance through the family line over generations. Then Conrad Poole paused, folded his hands in front of him, and looked at Renata with the expression of a man choosing his words with the kind of care usually reserved for documents that will be signed. "I want to be clear that everything I am about to tell you is preliminary," he said. Final valuations will require additional specialist assessment, formal authentication, and in some cases, auction estimation. These numbers may change. Some will go higher. A few may be revised downward. Do you understand that? Yes, she said. The currency, at face value and collector premium, is in the range of $4 to $6 million. The coin collection, based on Dr. Brace's preliminary review and current market comparables for the confirmed pieces, is between $60 and $80 million in auction value. The paintings, pending full authentication and condition reports, represent a combined estimated auction value of somewhere between $150 and $200 million. The jewelry requires gemological evaluation, but based on visual inspection of the stones and the setting quality, it is reasonable to anticipate a significant additional value. There is also the documentation, which includes what appear to be original stock certificates, bond instruments, and property records that have not yet been fully reviewed. He stopped. The portable work lights hummed faintly in the silence. Taking everything into account, including the documentary assets, this collection represents a total estimated value in the range of $275 to $330 million. For purposes of any preliminary planning, I would suggest using $305 million as a working figure, which represents a moderate midpoint estimate. But I want to emphasize, I understand, Renata said quietly. Preliminary. Yes. She stood in the vault room with the work lights and the shelves, and the three specialists who had spent 4 days cataloging what her uncle had spent a lifetime assembling, and she held the number in her mind the way you hold a compass in a high wind, carefully, with both hands, not letting the magnitude of it knock you over. $305 million. She thought of the banded currency she had laid out for a motel room that smelled of cigarette smoke. She thought of the granola bars. She thought of the fluorescent light in the shelter that flickered over Mila's homework. She thought of the woman in the buttoned coat who had told her there was no future in this building. She thought of her uncle in his top-floor apartment with the 1959 law degree and the handwritten will, looking down from his window at the changing city, refusing every offer, maintaining the oiled hinges on the basement door, keeping the padlock clean while the rest of the building slowly accumulated its violations and its reputation as a ruin. Waiting. She did not cry. She had used up the kind of tears that come from relief a long time ago, and in the early days of the shelter when she cried at night so that Mila wouldn't see it. What she felt now was something older and quieter, the feeling of a long sentence finally reaching its end. "Thank you," she said to Conrad Poole. "All of you." She did not tell anyone immediately. Not Mila, not Felix at the laundromat across the street. Not even Delphine Marsh, with whom she spoke that evening, though Delphine already knew from Conrad's report and was already several steps into planning what would need to happen next. The legal structure for the estate, the tax implications, the insurance requirements for assets of this magnitude, the authentication pipeline for each category of item, the security arrangements that would need to be in place at the hotel immediately. Renata listened to all of it and agreed to all of it and said the right things and then went back to the shelter and sat in the dark beside her sleeping daughter and thought about what had just happened and tried to find the edge of it, the place where the reality of it stopped and could not. $305 million. In a basement beneath a condemned hotel in a transitional neighborhood that everyone had written off, in a vault behind a door with a combination built from family numbers, maintained by a solitary man who had lived alone with a secret for decades, left to a niece he had met 4 times and trusted anyway, the same way the earth trusts a tree growing from rock to find its own water. She thought of Arthur's note. She will know what to do with it. She had not yet decided what to do with it. But she was beginning to understand the shape of the question. The news did not stay contained, because no news of that magnitude ever stays contained. It began to leak within 2 weeks, the way water finds cracks in stone, not through any single breach, but through the accumulated pressure of many people knowing pieces of the truth. Conrad Poole's assistants mentioned the assessment to colleagues. Dr. Brace described the coin collection, without naming the owner, to another numismatist over the phone, and that numismatist told someone else. One of the insurance assessors who came to establish security protocols mentioned to his wife that he'd had an unusual day, and his wife mentioned it to her sister, who worked in a real estate office where Sinclair Graham was known. Graham contacted Delphine Marsh's office within 3 weeks of the vault assessment. He did not call with another offer. He called with a lawyer. The lawyer's letter arrived by courier and was long and constructed in the specific architectural style of legal documents designed to intimidate through sheer density of language. It raised questions about the validity of the handwritten will. It suggested that the addendum attached to the estate documents may not have met the formal witnessing requirements of the state. It referenced at length the unpaid property taxes, the condemnation status, and the potential for city action. It enclosed documentation of what it claimed was a prior verbal agreement between Arthur Voss and a real estate holding company associated with Graham for a right of first refusal on the property. Renata read it at the kitchen table of the shelter common room, while the other residents moved around her, making coffee, talking quietly, doing the ordinary business of surviving. She read it twice. Then she put it in her bag and went to see Delphine Marsh. Delphine had already seen it. She had her own copy, flagged with colored tabs, and her expression was the expression of a lawyer who has been shown a complicated problem and has already begun to solve it. "The will challenge is weak," she said. "Arthur signed the addendum in the presence of his attorney, who is now deceased, but the notarization is valid and the signature is verified. The prior agreement letter is more interesting. It claims a right of first refusal, but there is no recorded instrument, no deed restriction. No filed document of any kind that would give it legal standing. It is a claim backed entirely by the word of Graham's holding company against the clear language of a properly executed estate document. In a court of law, this does not amount to a serious challenge." "But it could delay things," Renata said. "It is designed to delay things," Delphine said, "and cost you money, which Graham is presumably calculating you do not have. He doesn't know about the vault. He may suspect something. The security presence at the hotel in the past 2 weeks has not been entirely invisible." She paused. "Renata, we need to move more quickly than I had originally planned. The authentication pipeline needs to accelerate. You need to engage an auction house, probably more than one, to begin the formal consignment process for the items that you intend to liquidate. And we need to resolve the tax situation with the city on the property before Graham finds a way to use it as leverage." "How much are the back taxes?" $42,000. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I borrow against the authenticated value of the coin collection? Just enough to clear the taxes?" Delphine looked at her. "You have a better option," she said. 3 of the coins Dr. Brace identified as highest priority for immediate sale are individually valued at between $800,000 and $1.2 million each. I can arrange an immediate private sale through a specialist dealer. It would take 10 days to 2 weeks. We sell 1 coin, clear the taxes, and establish your ownership position before Graham can complicate it further." Renata nodded. "There is one other thing," Delphine said, and her tone shifted slightly, carrying something that Renata identified after a moment as the careful delivery of information that was good, but also large. "The authentication reports from Dr. Vance on the paintings came in this morning. The Dutch panel is confirmed. It has been identified as a work by a minor but documented member of the Leiden School, circa 1660, and Dr. Vance has traced its provenance through a private European collection that dispersed in the late 1940s. Given the post-war dispersion context, it will require provenance review to confirm clean title, which is standard for works of this period. but assuming clean title, which she believes is likely given the documentation in the vault, the painting's current auction estimate is between $40 and $60 million. Renata looked at her. "One painting," she said. "One painting," Delphine confirmed. The coin sold in 11 days. A private collector in another state, whose name Renata was not told and did not need to know, paid $940,000 for a 1907 St. Gaudens ultra-high-relief double eagle in condition that Dr. Brace described in his report as museum quality. The funds were transferred, the taxes were paid, the condemnation status remained but was no longer threatened by imminent city action, and Sinclair Graham's lawyer received a formal response from Delphine's office that was precisely as long and architecturally dense as the original letter, and which addressed each point with the specific citation and documented evidence that turned a list of implications into a list of refuted claims. Graham himself appeared at the hotel 2 days later. Renata was there when he arrived. She had been spending more time at the hotel now, not in the basement, which was under proper security, but in the lobby and the upper floors, making her own notes, thinking about the building's future. She heard the car pull up outside and looked through the gap in the boards over the front window and saw a man in an expensive coat step out, look up at the building's facade with the expression of someone calculating load-bearing capacity and demolition cost simultaneously, and walk toward the side entrance. She opened the door before he reached it. Sinclair Graham was perhaps 50, with the kind of tan that comes not from outdoor work, but from deliberate maintenance, and the kind of stillness that some men develop when they have spent enough years being the most powerful person in every room they enter. He looked at her with an expression that was perfectly calibrated between warmth and authority, the expression of a man who has found that the combination makes people feel simultaneously at ease and outmaneuvered. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I wanted to come in person. I feel like we got off on the wrong foot." "We didn't get off on any foot," she said. "Your lawyer sent a letter. My lawyer responded to it. That's a foot for each of us." A brief pause. Then he smiled, and the smile was genuine enough to be disconcerting. "You're direct. I respect that." He looked past her into the lobby, his eyes moving over the space with professional assessment. "This building is remarkable, you know. Beneath everything, the bones are extraordinary." "I know," she said. "I've been living in it." "I'd like to make you a real offer," he said. "Not the number from before. A real one, reflecting the full potential of the asset. I have a development plan that would preserve the facade, incorporate the lobby, create something significant for this neighborhood. Something that would genuinely—" "No," she said. He waited, as if expecting the word to be followed by a condition. "No," she said again, without addition. He studied her. The calibrated warmth receded slightly, making room for something more unadorned. "You understand what you're taking on?" he said. "A project of this scale, without institutional backing, without development experience, the neighborhood, the permitting process, the financing structure required." "Mr. Graham," she said quietly, "I used to be a hotel concierge. I know this building. I know what it needs, and I know what I'm doing. And I know that the value of what's inside it is not something you or anyone else is going to leverage away from me with letters and phone calls." She held the door frame and looked at him steadily. "The building isn't for sale. Have a good afternoon." He left. The dust of his departure settled back over the sidewalk, and she stood in the doorway and watched his car until it turned the corner. Then she went back inside and stood in the lobby with her hands at her sides, and the pale light coming through the gap in the window boards falling across the floor in a long, bright line. And then she let herself, very briefly, feel the size of what she had just said, not the triumph of it, the weight of it, the commitment it contained. She looked up at the chandeliers. "Okay," she said quietly, to the building, to her uncle, to whatever else was listening. "Let's see what we can do." Mila saw the hotel for the first time on a Saturday in March. Renata brought her in the early afternoon when the light was best, when the gaps in the window boards threw the lobby into a particular kind of illumination that made the space feel less like a ruin and more like something between states. She had swept the lobby again that morning and replaced 2 of the burned-out light bulbs in the temporary work lamps the security team had set up, so the room had both natural and artificial light moving through it. And the chandeliers above caught all of it and distributed it in the characteristic way that good crystal does, scattering it into small spectral fragments that moved slowly across the plaster ceiling as the light shifted. Mila stood in the center of the lobby and turned in a slow circle, looking up. Her gray eyes moved across the ceiling, the chandeliers, the staircase, the carved banisters, the old front desk with its dark wood panels. "This is ours?" she said. "This is ours," Renata said. Mila turned again. "It smells old." "It is old. But it's good old." She stopped turning. "Like a library." Renata smiled at that. "That's exactly right." They walked the building together, Mila asking questions and Renata answering honestly when she could and saying "I don't know yet" when she couldn't. On the 3rd floor, they found a room where the original wallpaper was still partially intact beneath a layer of later paint, a pattern of small leaves and architectural details in green and gold that surfaced at one corner where the paint had peeled. Mila pressed her palm flat against it. "Can we keep this?" she asked. "That's the plan," Renata said. They did not go to the basement. That was not something Renata was ready to share yet. Not because she was hiding it from her daughter, but because some things require their own time to be real. The vault and its contents were still in the process of becoming real to her, still cycling through the gap between evidence and belief. She needed it to be fully solid before she gave it to someone else to hold. But when they stood at the lobby window together that afternoon and looked out through the gap in the boards at the street, at the laundromat across the way, at the bent iron fence and the missing letters on the marquee and the neighborhood that had lived its own complicated life around this building for decades, Renata felt the shape of what was possible beginning to clarify. She thought of the wind turbine in the old story, how it stood battered on the ridge while the valley laughed, how it turned the night the power died and the lights came back on in the homes below. She thought of how that story was not really about a machine. It was about what happens when one person refuses to let a thing die that still has life in it. She put her arm around Mila's shoulders. "What do you think it should be?" she asked. Mila thought about this seriously, in the way that 9-year-olds think about things that deserve serious consideration. "A place where people come," she said finally. "Like before, but better." Renata looked out at the street. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it should be." The news broke in the local paper on the last Thursday of March. She had not released it. Neither had Delphine. But the private sale of the coin had generated a record in a specialized dealer's database that a local journalist who covered arts and culture had found through a source who covered auction markets, and that journalist had done enough digging to connect the coin's provenance to the Voss estate, and from there to the hotel, and from there to Renata. The story ran under a headline that Renata found in her phone on a Thursday morning in the shelter common room, sitting with her coffee before her shift, and which caused her to set the cup down carefully and read the article 3 times. The headline said, "Homeless Mother Inherits Condemned Hotel, Finds Possible Fortune in Hidden Basement Vault." The article was factual, mostly accurate, drawn from public records and one unnamed source. It described the property, the inheritance, the tax situation, the coin sale. It was careful about the vault's contents, describing them only as a collection of significant value currently under assessment by specialists. It did not put a number on anything, but it did include a photograph of Renata that had been taken without her knowledge, apparently from a distance. As she stood outside the hotel looking up at the facade, her coat insufficient for the cold, her expression the expression of someone measuring a thing and not yet knowing the result. She looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she picked up her coffee, finished it, and went to work. By the time her shift ended, the article had been shared several thousand times across the region's social media platforms, picked up by 2 national outlets, and had generated 93 interview requests to Delphine's office contact line. 3 television news vehicles were parked outside the shelter when she returned to pick up Mila, and the shelter director, a calm and practical woman named Ms. Areola, met her at the door and walked her in through the back entrance and told her that she had issued a statement asking the press to respect the residents' privacy, which the press had respected for approximately 4 minutes before parking closer to the main entrance and waiting. "You need to leave here," Ms. Areola said, not unkindly. "Not because of anything you've done wrong, but this level of attention is disruptive to the other residents and to the children. You understand?" "I understand," Renata said. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Renata thought of the hotel, the top-floor apartment where Arthur had lived, which was empty and which had a working door and a kitchen with dishes still in the cabinet. "Yes," she said, "I do." She packed what they had, which was not much, into 2 bags. Mila helped without being asked, folding her clothes with the careful efficiency of a child who had learned to pack and unpack many times. When she was done, she stood with her bag on her shoulder and looked at the narrow room that had been their space for the better part of a year, at the cot and the desk, and the water-stained wall. "Ready?" Renata asked. "Ready," Mila said. They walked out of the shelter into the late March afternoon, past the news vehicles with their cameras and their reporters who called out questions that she did not answer, past Felix's laundromat, where Felix was standing in the doorway watching, and raised his coffee cup slightly when she passed, and down the 4 blocks to Calloway Street, where the Voss Grand Hotel stood at the corner, its condemned facade facing the pale sky, and its missing marquee letters spelling out the incomplete name of a building that was still deciding what it wanted to become. She unlocked the side door. It opened easily, as it always did, on the well-oiled hinges of a door that had been maintained with care for reasons she was only beginning to fully understand. She held it open for Mila, who walked in without hesitation, her bag on her shoulder, her gray eyes moving up the dark stairwell toward the floors above. Renata stepped in after her and pulled the door closed. The building settled around them, quiet and massive, 6 stories of limestone and brick and memory, and in its basement, behind a vault door with a combination built from family numbers, $305 million waited in the particular darkness of a space that had been sealed until it mattered. Outside, and the city moved through its Thursday afternoon with the indifferent continuity of a thing that forgets. But in the hotel on Calloway Street, in the building that the neighborhood had written off, in the property that a developer had tried to pry away with legal language and leverage, and the comfortable assumption that a homeless woman with a 9-year-old daughter would not be able to hold what she had inherited, 2 people climbed the stairs toward the top floor, where a narrow bed was neatly made and dishes still waited in the kitchen cabinet, and where a window looked out over the rooftops of the city that had forgotten them. Mila reached the landing first. She looked at the apartment door, then back down the stairwell at her mother. "Is this home?" she asked. Renata reached the landing beside her and put her hand on the door. It's starting to be," she said. She opened the door. The afternoon light came through the top-floor windows and fell across the floor in long, clean lines, illuminating the dust that moved slowly through the air, the way it had been moving through this building for decades, unseen, patient, waiting for someone to open a window and let the world back in. April came to Calloway Street the way spring comes to places that have been cold for a long time, tentatively at first, then with increasing conviction, as if the season itself needed to be persuaded that it was welcome. The iron fence around the hotel lot acquired a faint green at its base, where new grass pushed through the gap between metal and pavement. The bent sections of fencing were straightened one morning by a man from the neighborhood named Darnell, who arrived without announcement, worked for 2 hours with a pipe wrench, and left without asking for anything. When Renata came out and found him finishing the last section, she asked him why. He shrugged. "Building looks better when the fence is straight," he said. "Seemed like it wanted to be." She thanked him. He nodded and walked away down Callaway Street with his pipe wrench over his shoulder, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked at the straightened fence and felt the neighborhood shifting around the hotel the way iron shifts when it warms, slowly, by degrees, but in a direction that cannot be reversed. The security team that Delphine had arranged was discreet and permanent now. 4 people in rotating shifts who maintained a quiet presence at the building without advertising it. The vault had been documented in its entirety, on every item photographed, cataloged, and entered into a formal estate inventory. 2 auction houses had been engaged for different categories of items, one for the coins and currency, one for the paintings and decorative arts. The jewelry had gone to a specialist gemological firm whose preliminary report had arrived the previous week and had caused Delphine to call Renata at 7 in the morning, which was not her habit. The jewelry, it turned out, included a parure of Colombian emeralds in early Victorian settings, provenance traced through a single family collection that had dispersed in London in 1947, and a matched pair of cashmere sapphire brooches that the gemologist described in her report with the kind of restrained technical language that, when translated into plain speech, it meant that she had not seen anything like them in 30 years of practice. The jewelry collection alone had revised the working estimate upward by somewhere between $15 and $22 million, depending on auction market conditions on the day. The working figure was no longer $305 million. It was closer to $328. Renata received this information at the kitchen table in the top-floor apartment while Mila ate breakfast before school, and she absorbed it with the same quality of stillness with which she had absorbed every number that came before it. The stillness was not indifference. It was the practiced composure of a woman who had learned to hold large things without letting them knock her over, because the alternative was to be swept away, and she could not afford to be swept away. There was too much to do. The restoration contractor's name was Ana Reyes, and she came recommended by 3 different people in 3 different conversations without Renata having mentioned her name first, which Renata took as the kind of sign that practical people trust. Ana was compact and deliberate, with the kind of attention that manifests not in words, but in the way her eyes moved across every surface she assessed, reading it the way a doctor reads a patient, looking for the truth beneath what was immediately visible. She walked the hotel on a Tuesday morning with Renata, top to bottom, taking photographs and measurements and making notes in a battered green notebook, with the concentration of someone who was having a continuous conversation with the building that Renata could only partially hear. On the 3rd floor, she stopped at the corner room where Mila had found the wallpaper, pressed her palm against it the way Mila had, and said without turning around, "Original Lincrusta Walton. 1953, maybe 1954. You don't find this intact anymore. This whole room should be preserved as reference for the restoration." She moved on without waiting for a response, as if the decision had already been made, and she was simply noting it for the record. In the basement, which Renata showed her with the vault closed and locked, Anna looked at the stone arches and the tile floor and the old wine cellar racks, and was quiet for a longer time than she had been quiet on any other floor. "The bones in this basement are better than anything above grade," she said finally. "The limestone is load-bearing, dry, and structurally coherent. The arches are original construction, probably pre-hotel, possibly dating to a warehouse or commercial building that occupied this site before 1954. She crouched and touched the hexagonal tile. "All original. No replacement sections. This is extraordinary preservation." "My uncle maintained it carefully," Renata said. Anna nodded, as if this explained everything, which in her world it probably did. Preservation was an act of will. Buildings did not maintain themselves. Someone always chose to tend them. She produced her preliminary scope and budget 2 weeks later. It was thorough and specific and priced with the honest directness of someone who does not inflate estimates for clients who appear to have money, because she had worked long enough to know that inflated estimates produce bad projects, and bad projects damage reputations. The full restoration to occupancy-ready condition, code compliance, historical preservation certification, and the lobby rehabilitation she described as the centerpiece of the whole effort would require approximately 8 months of work and a budget that was substantial by any ordinary measure. By the measure of what was in the vault, it was a rounding error. Renata signed the contract on a Thursday afternoon in the top-floor apartment, with Mila doing homework at the kitchen table and the sounds of the street coming up through the open window, and felt the particular satisfaction of a signature that does not commit you to something you cannot afford. She had not felt that in a very long time. The mockers came to terms with what had happened in different ways and at different speeds. The way people always do when the thing they dismissed turns out to have been the most significant thing in the room. The woman in the buttoned coat, whose name Renata eventually learned was Mrs. Estelle Haverford, appeared at the hotel one morning in late April, carrying a covered dish and an expression that combined dignity with something that required genuine effort to maintain. She stood at the side door and waited, and when Renata opened it, she held out the dish and said, "Lamb stew. I make it well." There was a pause that contained a great deal. "I was not kind to you," she said. "I was not kind, and I was wrong, and I find that I cannot simply walk past this building without acknowledging both of those things." Renata took the dish. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." Mrs. Haverford sat in the lobby on one of the chairs Renata had cleaned and repaired, and they drank tea from mugs that did not match, and Mrs. Haverford told her about staying here as a young woman in 1961, about the lobby that had glowed, about the staircase that she had thought the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in a building. She described the front desk clerk who had remembered her name on her second visit and had left a small vase of flowers in her room without being asked. And when she finished telling this story, she was looking at the lobby around her with an expression that was not grief, but something more complicated. The emotion of someone who has been shown that what they thought was gone was only waiting. "It will be that again," Renata told her. "Better." Mrs. Haverford looked at her with the clear eyes of a woman who had been wrong once and intended not to be wrong again. "Yes," she said. "I believe it will." The two women from the laundromat came separately, on different days, both of them drawn by the same general pull of curiosity and conscience. One of them brought her daughter, who was a year older than Mila, and who shook Mila's hand very formally when introduced, in the way that children do when they are trying to make up for something their parent did without understanding fully what it was. Felix from the laundromat did not come, because he had never left. He had been there all along with his coffee cup on the windowsill, and the morning after the news article ran, he had switched from leaving 1 cup to leaving 2, as though the acknowledgement of company was itself a form of homecoming. The men from the feed store and the auction yard in the first story would have recognized the arc of it. The people who call a thing foolish and then stand in the presence of what the foolish thing has become and find themselves recalibrated. Not humiliated, not punished, not made to suffer for their doubt. Simply shown. The showing was enough. Sinclair Graham did not come. He sent instead a brief letter through his lawyer that was 3 sentences long and in plain language, which was itself a kind of admission, because people who have lost the argument they were making through documents abandon the documents. The letter noted that his client no longer had any claims or interests in the property at 412 Calloway Street and wished Ms. Voss well in her endeavors. Delphine read it, noted it for the file, and did not respond because there was nothing to respond to. Renata read it once and put it in the same drawer where she had put the original offer letter. She did not think about Graham again. He was not the point of the story, and she knew it. The point of the story had never been the people who stood in the way. It had been the building and the vault, and the oiled hinges on the basement door, and the woman who had been forgotten by the city and who had refused, in the stubborn, irreducible way of things that grow on rock, to become what she had been told she was. The auction results came in over the course of 3 months, released in stages as different categories of items were authenticated, cataloged, and brought to market. The coin collection's first auction, 46 lots over 2 days at a specialized house, achieved a total hammer price of $67 million, which was at the lower end of Dr. Brace's estimate, and which he attributed to one particularly exceptional piece going to a single collector in a private arrangement that suppressed competitive bidding on that lot, rather than to any weakness in the market for the collection as a whole. He expected the second phase to compensate. It did. The second phase, 41 lots, including the complete St. Gaudens series, ran 11 days later and achieved a total of $79,600,000, setting 2 individual lot records for the category. The paintings came to market over a longer period, as authentication and provenance review for items of that age and significance required patience and rigor that could not be abbreviated. The Dutch panel, cleared of any restitution claims after provenance research, confirmed its pre-war ownership history and its passage through legitimate channels in the post-war period, sold at a major international house for $51,200,000. The 2 American Impressionist works sold the following month for a combined $23,400,000. The mid-century American works, whose attribution had been confirmed as originally estimated, brought a further $18,900,000. The currency, jewelry, documentary assets, and miscellaneous items from the vault were liquidated over the following weeks through a combination of auction, private sale, and direct institutional purchase, the last category applying to the bond instruments and stock certificates, some of which retained face value, and some of which carried collector premium as historical artifacts. When the final accounting was assembled by Delphine's office on a morning in late summer, the total net realized value of the vault's contents, after auction fees, specialist costs, legal fees, and applicable estate taxes, was $261,400,000. Renata sat across the desk from Delphine Marsh in her office and looked at the number on the document in front of her, and for the first time since January, since the certified letter had arrived at the shelter address, since she had stood on the sidewalk across from the building and felt the compass needle find its north, she felt the full weight of what had happened settle into her bones with the permanence of something that was no longer arriving but had arrived. $261 million. Clear, authenticated, liquidated hers. She thought of her uncle. She thought of him maintaining the vault for decades, oiling the hinges, resisting the offers, living alone with the knowledge of what was in that basement, the way the earth in the second story lived with the knowledge of what was in it beneath the stone. Holding it, keeping it, waiting for someone he trusted to receive it. She wondered if he had known how long she would need it, whether he had somehow calculated. And from the distance of a solitary life on the top floor of a building the city had written off, that his niece would come to need this at exactly the moment she did. She did not think so. She thought it was simpler than that. She thought he had simply loved the building and loved the idea of the building's future, and known in the bone-deep way of people who are stubborn and solitary and right in ways that others cannot see, that if he left it to the right person, the future would find its way. She thought, he left me a key, a combination, and a note. Everything else was already there. "What would you like to do first?" Delphine asked. Renata looked up from the document. "I'd like to finish the lobby," she said, "and then I'd like to bring Mila to see it." The chandeliers were the last thing restored. Everything else had been done first. And in the correct order, the way buildings are healed, from the foundation up, from the structural to the decorative, from the necessary to the beautiful. The roof was replaced entirely. The electrical system was rewired throughout. The plumbing was modernized. The elevators, which had not operated in 30 years, were rebuilt with new mechanisms and their original brass doors refinished to match the salvaged documentation photographs. The 6 floors were restored room by room, each one returning to something that resembled its original character while meeting every current code requirement. The 2 imperatives Ana Reyes balanced with the precision of someone who understood that a building's history and its future were not in conflict, but in conversation. The lobby took the longest. The marble floors were cleaned, sealed, and where damaged, repaired with stone sourced to match the original. The front desk's dark wood panels were refinished, the staircase banisters, the carved dark wood that Renata had noticed on her very first visit, were cleaned and oiled and restored to the depth of color they had carried in the 1954 photograph. The plaster ceiling was repaired and repainted. The wallpaper was documented, sampled, and reproduced for the rooms that had retained it. The small leaves and architectural details in green and gold that Mila had pressed her palm against on her first visit. And then the chandeliers. They were lowered on a Thursday morning, each one handled with the specific reverence that objects deserve when they are both beautiful and old. The crystals were cleaned individually, each piece removed, and washed in a solution Anna's restoration team had sourced through a specialist, dried, and replaced. The metal frameworks were polished. The wiring was replaced with modern components hidden within the original housing. The process took 4 days per chandelier, and there were 3 of them. When they were raised back into place on the ceiling of the lobby on a Friday afternoon in early October, Ana Reyes stood on the floor below and looked up at them with her head tilted back and her arms at her sides, and said nothing for a long time. The low autumn light came through the lobby windows, which now had glass in them, real glass, the boards long gone, the frames repainted the same dark green they had been in the original, and that light hit the crystals and scattered across the ceiling and the walls and the marble floor in the fractured, multiplied way that only well-cut crystal can produce, turning the ordinary light of a Friday afternoon into something that seemed to have been made specifically for this room. Ana turned to Renata. "That's it," she said simply. "That's the building." Renata brought Mila that evening after school, before the formal opening that was planned for the following month. She wanted Mila to see it first, the way you give someone the first sight of a thing when that thing belongs partly to them by right of what they carried to get here. They walked through the side door, which still had its well-oiled hinges, and through the service corridor, and then Renata stopped at the lobby entrance and let Mila go ahead. Mila walked into the lobby alone. She stopped in the center of the marble floor and looked up at the chandeliers, so at the crystals scattering their light across the ceiling, at the carved staircase rising to the floors above, at the restored front desk and the long windows with their dark green frames, and the last of the October light coming through them and moving across the floor in warm, shifting lines. She stood there for a long time, not speaking. Renata watched her from the doorway. Mila was 10 now, old enough to understand, in a way that 9 could not quite reach, what this building represented. Not the money, not the vault, not the auction results that she had heard pieces of over the months without being given the full accounting, because she did not need the full accounting. She understood it in the way children understand things when they have lived through their meaning. She had packed 2 bags and carried them out of a shelter. Nay, she had pressed her palm against a piece of original wallpaper and asked if they could keep it. She had sat in the lobby with her homework on a cleared stretch of floor while the restoration crew worked around her, and she had eaten lunch on the staircase, and she had fallen asleep in the top-floor apartment to the sound of the building being remade. She understood what this place was. After a long time, she turned to her mother. "It's better than the picture," she said. Renata crossed the lobby and stood beside her daughter in the light of the chandeliers, and they both looked up at the crystals turning the ordinary world into something luminous. And Renata thought of the wind turbine in the old story, the blades turning against the stars while the valley lay dark below. Had the lights coming back on in the windows of the homes that had laughed, and she thought of the buried water finding its way through cracked stone, the young tree rising from the place where the old one fell, and she thought of the photograph of Arthur in his dark suit in 1954, his chin lifted, believing in the thing he was building, and she thought of the note on the kitchen table upstairs. She will know what to do with it. She did. The Voss Grand Hotel reopened on the 14th of November. Not to guests, not yet. The guest rooms were ready, the elevators ran. The front desk was staffed by a team that Renata had hired and personally trained over the preceding weeks, drawing on the 12 years of hotel experience she had accumulated before the world had decided temporarily that she was not worth keeping. So the menu for the ground floor restaurant, occupying the space that had once been the old dining room off the lobby, had been developed in consultation with a chef from the neighborhood whose name was Tomas, who had been cooking out of a food cart on Dement Street for 3 years because he could not afford the capital to do anything else, and who had cried briefly when Renata offered him the position, and then composed himself immediately and begun discussing the menu with a precision and energy that told her she had chosen correctly. The reopening was a community event. That had been her decision, and it had not been complicated. The neighborhood had lived beside this building through its long decline and its longer silence, and it deserved to be the first to see what it had become. She sent invitations to everyone on Calloway Street and the surrounding blocks. She sent one to Mrs. Haverford. She sent one to Felix at the laundromat, who arrived early and stood near the front desk with a look of a man who is trying to be composed about something and not entirely succeeding. She sent one to the city building inspector who had processed the final certificate of occupancy, a man named Weston who had walked the completed building with his clipboard and his professional thoroughness and had paused in the lobby with his clipboard at his side and his eyes on the chandeliers for a moment before recovering himself and noting the exit sign heights. She did not send one to Sinclair Graham. The evening began at 6. By 6:15 the lobby was full, and the people of the neighborhood moved through the space with the tentative reverence of people entering somewhere they were not sure they were allowed to be, and then gradually with the ease of people who have decided that they are allowed, that this was built for them as much as for anyone. They touched the banisters. They looked up at the chandeliers. They sat in the chairs near the front desk and talked to each other in the particular way people talk when the setting is beautiful and the talking feels appropriate to it. Tomas's food came out of the kitchen and disappeared immediately and came out again. Mila, in a dress she had chosen herself and which was the same green as the wallpaper she had found on the 3rd floor, moved through the crowd with a confidence that Renata watched with a private, an enormous feeling she could not have named except to call it the opposite of the feeling she had known in the shelter, the opposite of forgetting. Mrs. Haverford stood near the staircase and looked at the lobby for a long time without speaking, and when Renata reached her, she took Renata's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment. "He would have loved it," she said. "Your uncle. He would have loved to see it like this." "I think he knew it would be," Renata said. Mrs. Haverford looked at her with clear eyes. "Yes," she said. "I think he did too." Later, when the evening was winding down and the neighborhood people were beginning to drift back out into the November night, Renata went down to the basement alone. The vault was closed, and as it had been since the last of its contents were removed for the auction and assessment process months ago. The shelves were empty now, the leather cases and the linen-wrapped paintings and the banded currency long since transferred to their various specialists and sale houses and final destinations. The vault room was clean and quiet and smelled of the same cool mineral air it had always held. She stood in the doorway with the light from the basement's new fixtures falling evenly through the restored space, the hexagonal tile clean beneath her feet, the stone arches above her exactly as they had been for 70 years, and she looked at the empty vault and felt the strange, specific peace of a space that has given what it held and is now simply itself. She thought about what her uncle had built here and why. Now, she had spent months piecing it together from the documents in the vault, from conversations with Delphine, from one long afternoon with a historian who specialized in mid-century private collections. Arthur Voss had begun accumulating the collection in the 1950s, when he was a young lawyer with a good income and a sharp eye and the particular discipline of someone who distrusts banks and trusts objects. He had bought coins when coins were cheap. He had bought paintings when the artists were not yet famous. He had bought jewelry from estates in the decades when estate sales were attended only by dealers. He had maintained the collection with the same patience with which he had maintained the building above it, not for display, not for sale, but for the same reason people preserve things they love, because they cannot bear for them to be lost. When the hotel closed and the neighborhood declined and the building took on its condemned and ruinous reputation, he had understood that the reputation was protective. A building everyone had written off was a building no one looked at closely. The vault was safest inside the ruin. The treasure was safest where no one thought to look. He had waited for someone who would not sell the building away. He had waited for someone who would stay. She thought of the stories. The farmer on the ridge with his dead turbine, standing in the wind while the valley laughed, the lantern moving through the girders in the dark while the people in their warm houses told jokes about folly. The farmer in the field striking the rock where the tree grew, the water coming up through the cracks, and the young tree rising from where the old one fell. Both stories were the same story. They were the story of what happens when a person refuses to accept the verdict that the world has issued on a thing that still has life in it. She had not known she was in that story when it began. She had not chosen it. She had simply been too stubborn to accept the alternative, the same stubbornness that had kept her working 3 jobs in a shelter rather than surrendering to the idea that her circumstances defined her ceiling. The stubbornness that had made her stand in the lobby of a condemned hotel with a flashlight and a notebook and see not ruin, but the shape of what ruin concealed. She looked at the empty vault one last time. Then she turned off the light, walked back up the stone stairs, locked the basement door behind her, and went back to the lobby. The hotel opened to guests in January, 1 year almost to the day from the morning the attorney's letter had arrived at the shelter address. The rooms were fully booked for the first month within 48 hours of the reservation system going live, which told Renata and the small team she had assembled that they had priced correctly and that the building's story, which had traveled further than she had intended and with more velocity than she could control, had generated a specific kind of interest in travelers who came not only for the hotel, but for the idea of it. The hotel that had come back, the building that had refused to be erased. They came to stand in the lobby under the chandeliers and feel the particular feeling of a place that has earned its existence. The ground floor restaurant became, within 3 months, something that the local food press began to describe with the kind of language reserved for places that are not merely good but necessary. Tomas cooked as though his whole professional life had been preparation for exactly this kitchen, which in a sense it had, and he hired from the neighborhood because Renata asked him to, and because he believed in it himself. And the dining room on Saturday evenings held families and couples and solo travelers eating beside each other in the warm light and the sound of a room doing exactly what it was built to do. The third-floor room with the original wallpaper was documented, preserved, and became the reference room for the historical restoration record that Ana Reyes submitted to the Preservation Society, which granted the building formal historical designation in March. that ensuring that its character could not be undone by whatever pressures the city might exert in future decades. The designation also ensured that no one could knock it down to build 15 residential stories on the land below, a fact that Renata noted without comment when the letter arrived. She established a trust with a portion of the realized estate funds. The trust was structured, under Delphine's guidance, to provide three things: permanent financial stability for the hotel's operation during any future difficult periods, a scholarship fund for children in the neighborhood whose circumstances resembled what Mila's had been, and a maintenance endowment for the building itself, ensuring that what her uncle had preserved for decades could be preserved in its restored form for decades more. She named the trust the Arthur Voss Foundation. It's because it seemed right, and because the man who had kept the oiled hinges and the clean padlock and the handwritten note deserved to have his name on the thing that his patience had made possible. On the morning that the foundation was formally established, Renata took Mila to breakfast in the restaurant before school. They sat at the table near the window that looked out onto Calloway Street, the same view she had through the gap in the window boards on that first day when she had stood on the sidewalk and put her hand on the iron fence and felt the compass turn. The street was ordinary. A truck made a delivery to the laundromat. Two women walked past in conversation, their breath visible in the cold. A child on a bicycle navigated around a patch of ice with careful deliberation. The morning was the morning, unremarkable and continuous. Mila ate her eggs and looked out the window. "Do you ever think about the shelter?" she asked. Renata looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said. "Do you?" "Sometimes." A pause. "I think about the light in the room, the one that flickered." "I remember. I used to try to do my homework fast before it flickered." Mila was quiet for a moment. "I don't think about it like it was bad," she said carefully. "I just think about it like it was before." Renata looked at her daughter, this person who had packed 2 bags without complaint and carried them out of a shelter, and walked into a condemned building and pressed her palm against a piece of original wallpaper, and asked, "Can we keep this?" And she felt a love so specific and complete that it had no language adequate to it. "That's exactly right," she said. It was before." Mila nodded, satisfied, and went back to her eggs. Outside on Calloway Street, the morning continued. The truck finished its delivery. The women walked around the corner. The child on the bicycle reached a clear stretch of pavement and pedaled faster. Above the street, on the facade of the Voss Grand Hotel, the new marquee letters, all of them present and properly anchored, caught the winter light and held it. There is a kind of story that people tell themselves about other people, a story that goes, "They got lucky. They were in the right place. Something fell into their hands that would have changed anyone's life, and so the change they experienced tells us nothing about them, only about fortune." This is the comfortable story, the one that requires nothing of the teller. It leaves the world the same shape it was before the telling, with luck distributed randomly and effort unconnected to outcome, and the people who told the woman on the sidewalk that there was no future in this building exactly as right as they believed themselves to be. The other story is harder to tell and harder to hold, but it is the true one. The true story is that the vault was there for anyone who owned the building. It had been there for 20 years of offers that Arthur had refused. It had been there when the city issued its condemnation notices and the developers circled with their calculations and the neighbors shook their heads. It had been there, sealed behind a door with a combination no one thought to try, in a basement no one thought to examine, in a building no one thought was worth examining. Because the story everyone had already told about the building made examination feel like wasted effort. Renata Voss owned the building because she was the only person Arthur trusted to stay. He trusted her to stay because he knew, from the 4 times they had met and the things her father had told him about his daughter, that she was the kind of person who does not stop because the world has decided something is finished. who looks at a condemned building and sees the marble under the dust, who reads a note that says, "Keep the basement locked until it matters," and understands that matters is not a matter of time but of person. The vault did not make her. She made the vault possible to find. This is the distinction that the comfortable story erases, and it is the distinction that makes the true story worth telling. And because the wind turbine on the ridge turned, not because the wind was exceptional, but because the man was stubborn, and the water came through the cracked stone, not because the earth was generous, but because the farmer struck it. And the $305 million in the basement of a condemned hotel on Calloway Street waited not for luck, but for the woman who would stand on the sidewalk in the cold and put her hand on the iron fence and refuse to be told that what she was looking at was worth nothing. The Voss Grand Hotel stood at the corner of Calloway and Dement as the winter settled into January, its windows lit from within, its marquee complete, the light from its lobby chandeliers laying soft and fractured patterns across the sidewalk outside, visible to anyone walking past. Visible to anyone who happened to glance toward it from across the street, a faint and particular illumination that had been absent from that corner for 30 years, and that the neighborhood had grown so accustomed to doing without that some of the older residents passing on their evening walks stopped for a moment and looked at the lit windows with the expression of people who have heard a sound they had stopped believing they would hear again. Inside, the building breathed. The elevators ran. The restaurant filled. The guest rooms held their guests in the warmth of restored walls and the dark wood of the staircase banisters and the particular old smell of a place that has been loved back into itself. In the basement, the hexagonal tiles were clean and the stone arches held. The vault room was empty, its door open now. Its darkness no longer sealed, no longer necessary, the secret that it held given fully to the light. And on the top floor, in the apartment where a solitary man had kept his oiled hinges and his clean padlock and his long, stubborn faith in the future, a woman and her daughter lived inside the proof of what patience looks like when it is finally allowed to become something larger than itself. The wind moved through the city the way it always does, indifferent and continuous, finding its way between the buildings and over the rooftops and down the streets. It moved over the Voss Grand Hotel the same way it moved over everything else, without preference or knowledge, without understanding what it touched. But in the building on Calloway Street, and in the chandeliers and the marble and the carved wood and the hexagonal tile and the room with the green and gold wallpaper and the table by the window where a girl ate her eggs and watched the morning, the wind found something it could not sweep away. It found the thing that had decided to stay. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.